I've never shared a bed, she whispered, eyes cast down. And from the doorway, he said the last thing she ever expected to hear, then share mine forever. It wasn't a proposal. It was a promise. And it didn't start there. It began the day Ruth stepped off the train into the fog-drenched station of Sage Hollow. The train let out a long aching whistle, echoing like a sigh from someone who'd finally found their way home, only too late. Steam curled from the engine's stack, winding into the thick fog that blanketed the valley, turning the station into a blurred silhouette of timber and shadow. No cheers, no reunions waited on the platform. Just one woman, standing still, a worn valise in one hand, and a letter so folded and unfolded its edges had frayed like cloth. Ruth Garner stepped down in shoes whose soles had thinned to the bone. Her steps were cautious, as if unsure the ground would still hold her. Her fingers clutched the letter, creased and softened the ink, smeared by the warmth of her skin. The address was faint now, nearly gone. But the name remained, Miss R. Garner. The handwriting had once looked careful, like the writer had hesitated long before committing ink to page. But now, under the pale mountain morning light, it looked more like desperation, wearing the mask of intention. She hadn't come west chasing adventure, nor romance, nor any blind hope. She came to disappear. And the fog mercifully asked nothing more of her. The station master, his face half swallowed by beard, pointed toward the stables behind the grain shed. Holt's waiting. Man, don't talk much. It was a short walk, but each step felt like the last line of a letter never sent. Beside the hitching post stood a man with a yellow-gray horse, arms folded, jaw dusted with 3 days of stubble, sleeves rolled revealing sun-dark skin honed by work. He didn't speak as she approached, only watched, his eyes the gray of river stone, unreadable, but not cold. "You Ruth Garner?" he asked, voice low and graveled like boots on shale. She nodded, gripping the letter tighter. "I got a wire. About a job." He stepped closer, eyes steady. "That was me. But I think there's been a mistake. I was looking for a widow from Denver. Same name. R. Garner. That's not you." Her stomach dropped. "No, it's not." He looked down, kicked at the dust. "Still, you came all this way." "I did." Wyatt Holt scratched the back of his neck, then sighed like setting down a weight he'd carried too long. "Storm's coming. You'd best ride with me. We'll sort the rest later." Ruth didn't argue. She hadn't come expecting kindness, certainly not charity. But what just happened felt like a seat on a train no one called her name for. He helped her into the saddle and tied the valise behind. She was awkward, clearly unused to riding, but he said nothing. They left town in silence, passing frozen fields, leaning fences and hills that looked like memories stacked on top of each other. The ranch appeared just as the ski shifted to pewter. Not grand, a timber and stone house, low barn. A chimney, breathing white smoke. 2 children stood on the porch, a girl with braided hair and keen eyes, and a boy clutching the railing like the wind might steal him away. Neither waved. Ruth didn't blame them. Wyatt dismounted, voice low. "You'll stay in the room off the kitchen." Was meant to be a schoolroom. Never got to it. She followed him into the house, which smelled of wood smoke, beeswax, and something older, maybe a sorrow, not yet spoken aloud. The small room was tidy. A narrow bed, a wash basin. A patched blanket folded at the end, its colors faded into time. "It stays warm in here," he said, one hand resting on the doorframe. "Storm'll be bad tonight. I'll bring in more wood." She looked at him, quiet. "You didn't ask what I'm running from." He didn't blink. "Don't need to. Folks don't come this far unless something's chasing them." She turned to the blanket, her fingers brushing the seams. "I've never shared a bed with anyone for one." He was silent a long while before saying, "Then share mine forever." The words hung between them. He didn't step inside, didn't smile, didn't take it back. It wasn't flirtation, it was something else. A man too tired for games, too honest to say what he didn't mean. Ruth sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, like holding something fragile. "You don't need to say things like that," she whispered. "I don't say things I don't mean." He left after that, the door closing behind him, with the softness of wind moving through dry grass. Outside, the snow began to fall quiet steady, as if it had all the time in the world. If you see a piece of yourself in Ruth's quiet escape, if you believe that even out here in the wilderness, soft promises can still be made, click subscribe to follow the rest of her journey. Each follower is like a porch light left burning, so we can keep telling stories long into the night. See you in part 2, where the secrets begin to stir. The first morning came gray and cold. Ruth woke early, her breath visible in the dim light, and pulled on her boots with hands that still trembled faintly. The fire in the stove had gone out hours ago, but she didn't complain. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the house. A strange calm had settled in her chest, one she didn't trust yet, but didn't want to lose it. The children were already awake. Lottie, in a flannel nightgown too big, sat at the table with a piece of charcoal scratching words into a scrap of paper. Eli was stacking dried beans into careful towers. Ruth greeted them with a soft, "Good morning," and they looked up, but didn't speak. That first lesson was simple. The alphabet for Eli, reading practice for Lottie. The girl was sharp, quicker than she let on, and Ruth saw it in the way her eyes flicked toward her brother, making sure he was following along. Eli, in turn, giggled when Ruth praised his careful penmanship, his gap-toothed smile wide with pride. Wyatt passed through only once, nodding his thanks, before stepping into the cold with an axe slung over his shoulder. Ruth watched him from the window a moment longer than she meant to. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, silent, that made her chest ache in a way she couldn't name. Days passed with the rhythm of chores and lessons. Ruth swept the floors, folded laundry, read to the children by firelight. In the evenings, she sat on the porch steps, shawl drawn tight, while the skeeter turned a deep cobalt. Sometimes Wyatt joined her, sitting a pace away, neither of them speaking much. But it wasn't silence that pressed, it was something softer waiting. One afternoon, while Ruth was mending Eli's shirt, Lottie sat down beside her and asked, "Do you think people can be gone and not dead?" Ruth looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "My mama," Lottie said, voice steady. "They say she died, but I never saw her body. Papa buried something, but it wasn't her." Ruth set the needle down. "That's a heavy thing to carry. I feel like she's out there, waiting to come back." Ruth didn't say no. She didn't tell her otherwise, because somewhere inside, she remembered that same desperate hope once long ago, and how cruel it felt when someone tried to take it. Their bond grew like ivy, slow and sure. Lottie began to lean into Ruth's side during readings. Eli brought her feathers he found in the yard. Wyatt began leaving small things for her to find: a jar of preserves, a pair of worn gloves mended at the fingers. Then Abner came. He arrived unannounced, riding up the ridge with a cloud of dust behind him. A tall man with slicked hair and a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said he was there to see his niece and nephew, brought gifts, candied nuts, and a carved wooden horse, but the way he looked at Ruth made her stomach clench. "I hear you're the new governess," he said that night at supper. "Seems sudden." I answered, "A letter," Ruth replied calmly. "That letter wasn't meant for you, though, was it?" Wyatt's fork clinked against his plate. "Abner." The man raised his hands, feigning innocence. "Just making conversation." But the next days turned brittle. Abner lingered too long in doorways, asked Ruth pointed questions about her past, left a newspaper clipping from New York on the table, one that mentioned a broken engagement and a runaway bride. "You're making trouble where there isn't any," Wyatt said one evening after Abner had gone to town. "He doesn't want me here," Ruth repeated. "He doesn't get to decide." She wanted to believe him. But then came the papers. A legal envelope yellowed and creased with Wyatt's name scrawled across the front. Inside documents, bearing the name of Wyatt's late wife, Martha Holt, and language that suggested the land they stood on still legally belonged to her, or more accurately, to her family. He forged that, Wyatt said, voice low and furious. "Can you prove it?" Ruth asked. "No. But I know," Abner added with a mock-sympathetic tone. "Law's tricky out here, especially when emotions get tangled. You don't want this place tied up in court for years, do you?" The next morning, Ruth packed her bag. Not because she believed Abner, but because she wouldn't be the cause of another man losing his home. As she folded her dress, she paused, fingertips lingering on the fabric, heart twisting with a memory of standing on a New York platform, bag in hand, alone again. She had promised herself then, never stay where you are not wanted. Lottie cried. Eli wouldn't speak. And Wyatt met her at the gate, jaw clenched tight. "You're leaving because of him." "I'm leaving so you don't lose what's yours. It's not mine without you." His voice cracked just a little, enough to stop her. He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Please," he said, "just that." And Ruth, who had run from so many things, stood still for the first time. She stayed, and the snow kept falling quiet, as breath thick as silence between two hearts, learning how to beat in rhythm again. The nights came colder now. Frost edged the windows before the sun had fully dipped, and Ruth had taken to lighting the fire earlier, just to keep the chill from biting into the children's bones. The rhythm of the house had settled into something steady, less like survival, more like living. By mid-October, the wind carried a sharper whisper, like these secrets, spoken in a language only the land understood. Ruth had learned to move through the house as if she belonged not just as a guest, but as something more rooted. Her hands bore the marks of work, knuckles raw, from washing, fingertips pricked by needles, and her heart, though still guarded, had softened in ways she hadn't thought possible. She remembered New York, in slivers, the damp gray of the tenement, the mirror fogged by breath. She could never catch the hiss of her fiancé's voice behind a locked door. She remembered her father's silence, the stiffness of the train ticket he handed her, like it was a receipt. And she remembered leaving her suitcase lighter than fear. The children had changed too. Lottie had begun humming again, tunes without names, but full of warmth. Eli followed Ruth everywhere, sometimes without a word, just needing to be near her shadow. They asked questions at night, about stars, about heaven, about whether their mothers still thought of them. Ruth answered carefully, with gentleness, instead of certainty. She found herself holding on to little things. Lottie's hair ribbon left on the railing, Eli's handwriting crooked but determined, the smell of bread rising in the mornings. Home wasn't in walls or names, it was in echoes of small routines that didn't hurt. One afternoon, Ruth sat beside Lottie, helping her write the name Martha with careful strokes. "I want to remember her in ink," Lottie whispered. Ruth squeezed her hand. "Ink doesn't forget." The moments with Wyatt deepened like rain, soaking into hard soil. He never spoke much, but when he did, it stayed with her. Once, as they cleaned out the chicken coop, he said, "You ever notice how quiet makes you hear more?" She had nodded too, moved to speak. And in that quiet they had learned one another's rhythms, how Ruth folded dish towels, how Wyatt always touched the horses' necks before mounting. They rarely touched, but when their fingers brushed passing plates or reins, it felt like something secret. Then came the letter. Abner had returned again, uninvited, again unwelcome, but this time with more than veiled threats. He arrived in a buckboard drawn by a flashy black gelding, dust rising behind him like smoke. He handed Wyatt a folded envelope. "From the county clerk," he said, voice all silk and wrought. "Found something interesting in the land deed. Thought you might want to read." Wyatt didn't open it right away. He waited until dusk when the house was quiet, and Ruth sat nearby stitching a rip in Lottie's hem. His face changed as he read first confusion, then a tight kind of stillness. "It says the title was never transferred," he said slowly. "That the land still legally belongs to Martha. To her family. Which means me," Abner said from the doorway, leaning in like a man who thought the house already his. "Unless you can prove otherwise. And good luck with that. No one wants to speak against me around here." Wyatt's jaw clenched. "You forged something. Prove it." Abner left then, but the echo of him stayed. That evening, Ruth found herself pausing while folding a quilt, the blue edges worn where little fingers pulled. The wind slipped through the seams of the house, and she wrapped the fabric around her shoulders. Her reflection in the window startled her. She looked older, more real. "If I hadn't come here," Ruth said quietly, as Wyatt stacked wood near the stove, "this wouldn't be happening." Wyatt's voice was rough. "You didn't cause this. He's been circling since before you arrived. But now you have something to lose." He crossed the room, then slow and sure, and knelt beside her. "I already lost once. That doesn't mean I stop living." She looked away, throat tight. "I'm not someone men keep. Not someone who stays. You're someone who fought to stand on her own 2 feet, he said. "That's worth keeping, not losing." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to stay. But the next morning, the doubt crept in, like cold under the door. Ruth packed what little she had moved quietly, not to wake the children. She left the blue ribbon Lottie had tied in her braid on the nightstand, folded neat, like a goodbye. She made it halfway down the drive, before Wyatt caught up. "I thought we agreed," he said, breath hard from running. "You'd stay. I don't want to be what costs you everything." He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. "Then stay and help me fight." She shook her head, tears threatening. "You don't understand what men like him can do. They twist things, ruin you from the inside out. I've seen that. But I've also seen you." Then he said it not as a plea, not as a command, but as a truth. "You belong here." She didn't answer, but she didn't walk away. That night, she braided Lottie's hair by lamplight and read Eli the same story she had read 3 nights before because he asked, and because routine had become safety. Afterward, she stood by the window while Wyatt sat at the table, pen in hand, drafting a response to the county. "We'll need a witness," he said without looking up. "Someone who knew Martha. Someone not bought by Abner. Will that be enough?" His eyes met hers. "It'll have to be." Later, when the children had gone to bed, she sat beside him on the porch. The night air was sharp, stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. He didn't speak, just reached for her hand. In that silence, she realized she'd stopped listening for danger. She was listening for his voice instead. Whatever came next, she would not run. She would stay. And for the first time in years, staying didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a stand. "I'm tired of running," she whispered to the wind. And the land, as if listening, let the wind soften to stillness. The legal notice arrived on a brittle November wind. Ruth found it tucked between the folds of the morning paper, sealed with a wax stamp and dusted with the scent of ink and resolution. The kitchen smelled of ash and coffee, and outside the frost-etched spider veins on the window pane. Wyatt opened the letter in silence, his thumb trembling slightly as he slit the paper open. Lottie and Eli watched from the hearth, their bodies still with unspoken hope. The words were plain legal, almost cold, but they hit like fire. Ownership of the homestead at Hollow Ridge was in the eyes of the territorial court legally, and Iole Wisis Wyatt Callahan's. The forged signature, the missing testimony, the deliberate delay. In the land transfer, Abner's manipulations had been brought into the light and dismantled. Wyatt saw for a long moment the paper clutched in his calloused hands, then passed it to Ruth. She read it twice, once with her eyes and once with her heart. And when she looked up, there was something steady and quiet in her gist. "We keep it," she whispered. "You keep it." He nodded, not in triumph, but in relief. But victory in the West never came unchallenged. That night, as snow whispered against the eaves, Ruth stood by the kitchen window. Her fingers trailed the rim of a chipped mug, steam curling into her face. Her thoughts wandered back farther than she liked. New York. The rain that never stopped. Her father's stiff goodbye at the station, a hand she didn't hold. The letter she had never intended to answer. She could still hear her fiancé's voice, smooth as varnish, telling her what she could be, what she must never be. She blinked hard and turned from the window. 2 days later, Abner returned. He came not with lawyers or clerks, but with a sheriff's deputy and a hollow threat masked as law. He stood on the porch like a man who owned time and land and blood. "I aim to petition for custody," he said. "These children need structure, need stability. And frankly, a man who believes his dead wife speaks through winter birds well that ain't stable." Wyatt's hand curled around the doorframe. "I never said," but others heard Abner cut in smoothly. Stories spread. The girl's been seen talking to herself. Strange things. Unnatural things. Ruth stepped forward before Wyatt could speak. "You're lying," she said softly, but with just enough truth to scare decent people. He tipped his hat to her. "You're not family. Not yet. Your word won't carry." Then he looked at Lottie, who stood in the doorway, fists clenched. "You'll see me in court." And he did. The courtroom was a small wooden building off the town square, its windows fogged with cold breath and judgment. Outside, a wind keened through the cracks. Inside, the air was thick with whispers. Ruth wore her plainest dress. Wyatt wore the same coat he had split wood in that morning. Lottie and Eli sat beside them, smaller than usual. The judge was a narrow-faced man, with fingers that drummed the desk absently. Ruth stood first. Her knees trembled beneath her skirt. She spoke not of law, but of life, of what the children needed, of the home they had made, of the silence that had been replaced with laughter. She paused once, pressing her lips together, when her voice caught. Wyatt didn't move, but she felt the warmth of his gaze settle around her like a blanket. The judge listened, impassive. Then Abner took the floor, presenting himself as the only surviving relative of Martha Callahan, widow, and the rightful guardian of her orphaned children. He painted Wyatt as unstable, grieving, to the point of delusion. He questioned Ruth's intentions, her past, her lack of blood ties. "I've seen grief twist a man," Abner said solemnly. "Twist him so far, he don't know what's real anymore." Then came the moment no one expected. The judge asked almost absently if the children had anything to say. Eli looked down, hands fidgeting. But Lottie stood. Her voice was small, but unwavering. "Uncle Abner said, if I told anyone what he did, he'd make sure we never saw Daddy again." The courtroom fell to a hush so heavy, it seemed to suck the air from the walls. The judge leaned forward. "What did he do, child?" "He yelled," she said. "He grabbed Eli once. He told me I was lying when I said I missed Mama. He said good girls forget." A gasp rippled through the benches. Ruth reached for her hand as she sat down, but Lottie's chin was already lifted. Stronger now. Seen. The decision came the next day. Wyatt retained custody. Abner was barred from contact. And still, Ruth packed her bag. She did it in silence, moving through the house like someone wrapping up a borrowed life. Her fingers lingered on the edges of Lottie's sketches, Eli's pinecone collection, the tin cup by the sink Wyatt always used. She left a note tucked under his coffee mug. You deserve peace. I don't know how to stay without breaking something. But he found her before she could leave. You're leaving, he said. It wasn't a question. Her throat was tight. I don't want to be the cause of another fight. You're not. You don't know that. He stepped closer. I know what it's like to want something and fear you'll ruin it by wanting too much. She met his gaze. I've never belonged anywhere. Not in New York. Not with my fiancé. Not even in my own skin. You belong here. She shook her head. I needed a place to hide. That's not the same. No, he said, voice low. But it's a start. She sat on the edge of the bed. I used to think the only way to survive was to keep moving. Not to care too much. Not to hold anything too long. And now she looked at him, then really looked. I think I'm tired of surviving. He knelt before her, hands resting on her knees. Then stay. Not because of them. Not because of me. Stay, because this place feels more like you than any other place ever has. She didn't answer. But she didn't finish packing either. That night, Wyatt sat beside the hearth, carving something from a scrap of cedar. Ruth sat across from him, her sewing untouched in her lap. What are you making? She asked. He held it up. A small wooden bird, wings outstretched. For Lottie, he said. So she remembers her voice matters. She smiled, the kind that held sorrow and joy in the same breath. And for the first time she let herself imagine what spring might feel like in a house that no longer feared winter. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch. But when the fire dimmed and the wind curled Keith around the eaves, Ruth stood and crossed the floor. She sat beside him, leaned her head on his shoulder. He didn't move, and neither did she. Outside, snow began to fall. But inside, something thawed. Not a vow, not yet, but a beginning. The winter storm was fierce enough to rewrite the world overnight. When Ruth woke, the landscape glowed in white branches bent under the weight of snow, fences barely visible under soft drifts. Inside the house, she dressed before dawn, calm and measured, though her heart was tangled with something more fragile. She had planned to leave that morning, the flames of the hearth burning behind her like a goodbye. She tied her boots and packed a small bag, folding in the mended cloths she had stitched by lamplight. She paused by Lottie's drawer, brushing a finger across the worn leather binding of the storybook she had brought. Lottie was breathing softly, elbow curled into the pillow, Eli snoring lightly in his cot. Ruth leaned out the door into the soft white hush. The steps were slippery. Her breath made halos in the lamplight as she descended. She didn't expect to see him standing at the bottom of the drive, bundled in coat and scarf, snow stuck in his hair and eyelashes. He held something out, a letter yellowed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakable and tender. From her, he said quietly. Your mother's last words to me. Ruth's hand, orphaned of sensation, took the letter. Her eyes scanned the page. Every word a pulse. Don't let grief fence off your heart, Wyatt. Love again when you can. That line circling like embers, bright and warm. Her vision blurred, but her mind anchored. He lowered his voice. You said you'd never shared a bed. His words were more than memory. They were a confession made solid in the snow. But now, this is not for warmth. It's for a life. She looked at him, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with recognition. In that moment, everything clicked into place: the snow, the silence, and the letter that invited her back to something both gentle and true. She stayed. They walked back toward the house together, through the drifts, side by side, silent, except for the scuff of their boots. Inside, the children woke to the feel of two presences in the room, where only one had ever belonged before. Spring arrived weeks later, subtly but undeniable. The snow melted the creek, swelled and hidden bulbs unfurled like surprise. The porch steps heaved up buds of green through thawing boards. One Sunday morning, Ruth and Wyatt stood before the porch railing. As the children watched, hands, small eyes wide. Lottie stood between them, holding that same letter printed on new paper. Wyatt took Ruth's hands in his voice. Quiet under blue sky will keep you safe. Never ask you to be smaller. A breeze stirred, tugging at their coats. Then it was Ruth's turn. She squeezed Wyatt's hands, words steady as the rising sun. I will walk beside you, as long as the road allows. Lottie read the last two lines of her mother's letter, not as farewell, but as a benediction, and finished, and to us all. Her voice trembled. Wyatt lifted her and twirled. Eli cheered, pounding a wooden stool. The snow gone, replaced with new green. Ruth greeted spring as a witness to what staying could become. That afternoon, she brewed coffee and stepped onto the porch. The world exhaled, buds opening, birds calling. He stepped beside her, placing his hand over hers, the same hand once filled with loneliness, and now full of promise. He said softly, "Where would you have ended up if you hadn't answered that letter?" She rested her head on his shoulder. "I don't know, but I know where I'm meant to be now." They watched the sky bloom, and in that quiet dawn, two hearts once wounded, once skeptical, became a home. Years passed in the way only time on a ranch can slow at first, then all at once. Children grew, trees thickened their trunks, and the porch wood grayed under boots and seasons. Ruth no longer counted winters. She measured time by Lottie's handwriting, by Eli's laugh, by the way Wyatt would still reach for her hand without needing a reason. The printing press stayed in the barn, still used on Saturdays when the chores were light. Ruth and Lottie printed poems, sometimes simple verses about fences, about the smell of coffee, about the feeling of hands not letting go. And on the bookshelf by the hearth sat a faded envelope, her name still legible in Wyatt's late wife's careful script. Ruth never reread it. She didn't need to. She lived its blessing every morning. There were hard years, yes. Droughts that cracked the soil, wind that howled like sorrow. But Ruth had known the kind of loneliness that makes a woman fold into herself. And she had known what it was, to be held steady when the world swayed. That steadiness, quiet, ordinary, sacred, was what love became. One spring morning, long after the children had grown and built homes of their own, Ruth stood at the edge of the pasture, shawl around her shoulders, watching the sun rise, where it always had. Wyatt came up behind her, slower now, a hitch in his step. She didn't look back, just said, soft as memory, "I never thought I'd belong somewhere." He kissed the top of her head, white now like snow that had come and stayed. "You belonged," he whispered, "the moment you stepped off that train." And in the hush between them, the world felt whole.